Let's start off by asking, what do you think of the big society?
I'm not entirely sure that I understand the concept.
The Big Society was a flagship policy adopted by David Cameron at the 2010 general election as a way to empower communities and individuals, as a way of taking politicians out of people's lives and allowing them to take more responsibility and decision-making within their locality. We gathered a range of interpretations about the Big Society and the effects of Thatcherism through the use of surveys and interviews. We began our investigation by asking people what they thought the Big Society is. Polling data from The Independent shows that around 56% of people don't actually know what the Big Society is, showing that there is a lack of awareness as to what this concept really means. Further polling data from YouGov shows that around 73% of people think that the Big Society is simply impractical.
I think they have gone for broad brush statements like big society, and people go yes or whatever. Literally, they go whatever. So I think people don't care.
Right.
Because they don't care about the big picture, they care about themselves.
People tend not to do things voluntarily anymore. They expect paying. And so as a consequence, you end up with a society that is so driven by finance that why would people do things for nothing?
And do you think that's part of the Thatcherite ideology, perhaps, in that Thatcher
Unquestionably.
created this society?
That, if you like, with hindsight, if you like, pre-Thatcherism, were we more aware and more caring of our local area? You know, like your neighbours or your school or something like that. I think we are more materialistic. I think we are more self-centred. And I think we want what's best for us.
Did that have a detrimental impact on the idea of communities?
Probably. Again, you go back to the 80s, not only is it Thatcherism, you go back to film and Gordon Gekko, Greed is Good. I knew many people who had 3 or 4 jobs to get lots of money. So they were happy to work 12, 13 hours a day to fill their pocket. And so people worked really, really hard, and you were able to get loads of jobs. There was lots of work to be done. But by doing that, the individual would lead over the community, because it was about me.
Over the past 30 years, there has been a general transition from collectivism towards individualism, thanks to the Thatcherite ideology. Despite this, most people perceive the Big Society to be a good idea. We conducted our own research within Falmouth and found that 60% of people thought that the Big Society was a good idea, in principle. We also found that around 55% of people thought that the Big Society was about empowering communities and individuals.
One of the major criticisms of the big society is that it's something middle-class people can get engaged with, but it's really not something that can benefit the people who really need the help.
Very true. Sure. If you have a look at public policy and look at Sure Start, which was something that the previous government set up, this was for what was it? It was an opportunity for people who are really poor to come to one place to be able to get childcare, dental, postnatal, perhaps even prenatal childcare in one building. Now, it was a brilliant idea, but unfortunately the middle class thought, this is cracking, and they'd go along and basically they took over, and in their bossy way, the truly poor didn't attend because they were frightened by the middle class mummies. And so this wonderful idea, which was extremely expensive, fell by the wayside because in fact the wrong people went.
Do you think the kind of community groups here are representative?
Tend to be older. Difficult to encourage younger people to get involved.
You know, these people just do not have the time available. You look at Cornwall Council. We're an old fogies club because only old fogies could afford to be on the council. But I say, we're back to big society again. Big society cannot run on a bunch of pensioners. It's very difficult to see how you do get that engagement of the majority of the population. And the more you push down responsibilities for locally important things to local people, the reality is that you're just burdening the same small group of people with more responsibilities and more pressures. I mean, that's where the big society falls down, in my opinion. It doesn't have a structure. It doesn't have a coordination to establish priorities, budgets, etc. Partly because that traditionally has been the role of local government in most of the areas that we're talking about here. Even if they haven't been the deliverers, they have been the organisers, regulators, funders. And now the local government is being pruned so much that they don't have the manpower, let alone the cash, to fulfil all those roles in local society that they've had in the past.
Yeah, what do you understand the big society to be?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. I think conservatives, I mean David Cameron, thinks it means filling in the gaps that the state used to fill. But it's a sort of new model idea of presenting a policy of reducing public spending, if that's actually what the government is doing, reducing public spending and replacing it with local volunteering, but also, for example, here in Penryn we've got quite an active food bank. That's not really what I think people see as being volunteering that fills a gap. I think some people see it as being a replacement for what the state should be doing. So I think it depends on your political perspective what the big society is. My idea is that actually I think it's a really good idea. But the problem is, I think politicians hijack ideas. And the problem you have with the big society in Britain is that in a state of austerity, which is what the government's attempting to deliver, you end up in a position where austerity is the driver and the big society replaces what the state was doing rather than being something extra, which is actually what I think David Cameron, when he came up with the idea, but presented the idea, was trying to achieve.
There is a perception that the big society is a cover for public spending cuts. The Independent carried out a poll in 2010 and found that 41% of people agreed with this view. We conducted our own research in Falmouth and found that 2/3 of people agreed with this view. Perhaps this shows that there is a growing perception that the big society is indeed a cover for the government's policies of austerity.
There's this big myth about Thatcherism that she cut back, about Thatcher's governments, that they cut back the state, they cut back the proportion of public expenditure in the wider economy. Well, in fact, they didn't. They did in some areas that had real regional implications, but by and large they kept the level of public expenditure as the same proportion of total national income.
At the minute, I think the effects of the cuts have really not yet come home to roost. The top-down approach tends to be a bit sort of shotgunish, doesn't it? It's sort of difficult to make anything other than one size fits all. I think the community up approach allows you to tailor and influence where money is going to be spent, and maybe there should be more of that. We've tried a little bit of that in the big local through what we call participatory budgeting, where big local has put a sum of money on the table and groups have stood up and said we think we should spend the money on this project or this project or this project, and they vote for it. Now it may come to the point where people have to choose between filling in potholes in the road or, I don't know, maintaining an effective library service, something along those sort of lines. So there may be more decisions that need to be made by the community locally on the backs of that we haven't got resources to fix them in.
Throughout this film, people generally have seen the big society as a good idea in principle, which challenges the Thatcherite belief in individualism. However, those involved in the big society perceive many problems with its implementation. These problems may be caused by the lack of funds from central government, but also by the ideological motivation which hinders the replacement of government by communities. The public is suspicious of the motives driving the big society. Many think that its function is to cover public spending cuts rather than empowering communities. The expectation that people can fill the vacuum left by government cuts seems to be unrealistic. It is more realistic to expect the big society to supplement basic services provided by the government rather than work on its own.
Potentially, the scale of cuts that government in the UK, but governments across Europe are trying to implement could lead to total social breakdown, or something very close to it. You've had Arab Spring, you've had major changes in the subcontinent's political systems, India and Pakistan. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that we are going to get a major social and political disturbance, an apocalypse out of the scale of cuts that are coming through.
And do you believe the big society is the answer?
No, no. And the big society would probably be a nice sticking plaster over that kind of problem. And you don't cure many apocalypses with a piece of elastoplast.
Bloody hell, I'm out of breath.